Hands where I can see them. Now, I'm a surgeon. There's a child dying on my table. Get out of the car, slowly. I have 4 minutes before she bleeds out. I said now. A trauma surgeon speeds through a red light at 11:47 p.m. A 12-year-old girl is open on an operating table 2 miles away, and the only person who can save her is stuck behind a patrol car with a gun pointed at his chest. This is the night Dr. Marcus Webb almost lost everything, not in the operating room, but on a dark stretch of Ashland Avenue, because a police officer decided a black man in a Lexus at midnight could not possibly be exactly who he said he was. Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about the split-second decisions that separate justice from tragedy, hit subscribe now, because what happened after this traffic stop will make you question everything you think you know about how these situations are supposed to end. Dr. Marcus Webb had been on call for 11 straight hours when his phone rang for the second time that night. He was 44 years old, a trauma and vascular surgeon at St. Vincent Memorial Hospital, the kind of doctor other doctors called when a case looked unsurvivable. He'd trained at Johns Hopkins, done his fellowship in Baltimore, and spent the last 13 years in this mid-sized Midwestern city because St. Vincent needed someone who could handle the surgeries nobody else wanted to touch. Pediatric trauma. Torn arteries. The cases where the margin between life and death was measured in single-digit minutes. He had just gotten home 40 minutes earlier. His scrubs were still in his bag on the passenger seat, not yet swapped for the grey sweatpants he'd been planning to sleep in. His wife, Danielle, an ICU nurse herself, had kissed him on the cheek and told him to actually rest this time. He'd made it as far as the couch when the hospital's number lit up his screen again. The nurse on the other end didn't waste words. Multi-vehicle collision, a 12-year-old girl, unrestrained in the back seat, thrown against the door frame, internal bleeding, possible aortic injury, blood pressure dropping every time they checked it. The on-call resident had opened her up already, but he'd hit something he couldn't control, and he needed the one surgeon in the building's rotation with enough vascular experience to close it before she coded. Marcus didn't remember standing up. He remembered his hands already moving, grabbing keys, grabbing his badge, telling Danielle he'd call when he could. What he did remember, with total clarity, was the drive. Every traffic light between his house and St. Vincent Memorial was a small private negotiation with time itself. Marcus had grown up in Cleveland, the son of a school administrator and a machinist, the first person in his family to finish college, let alone medical school. He remembered his mother telling him, when he was 16 and had just gotten his license, exactly what to do if he was ever pulled over. Hands on the wheel, speak clearly, move slowly, don't reach for anything until you say what you're reaching for. It was a conversation nearly every black parent in America has with their child, at some point, a set of rules passed down not as advice, but as survival instructions, and Marcus had followed them without exception for 28 years of driving. He had never once been in an encounter with police that had gone beyond a routine warning. He believed, in the quiet way people believe things they've never had reason to test, that the rules worked, that following them properly was enough. That belief would not survive the night of October the 14th. He drove a black Lexus Bodycam, 4 years old, paid off, the first new car he'd ever bought himself after his residency ended. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't a status symbol, it was reliable, and reliability mattered to a man whose entire professional life depended on showing up exactly when he was needed. That night, reliability wasn't enough. He needed speed. The streets were nearly empty at that hour, which should have made the drive easier. It made it faster, and it made it more dangerous in a different way, because empty streets meant no witnesses, no context, no one else on the road to make a lone car moving fast at midnight look like anything other than what a tired mind might assume it to be. Officer Kyle. Bratton had been patrolling this stretch of the city for 6 years. On paper, his record looked clean enough. Underneath, if you dug, there were 3 prior complaints, 2 dismissed after minimal review, 1 resolved with a verbal warning, and a training refresher that lasted an afternoon. Bratton had a reputation among some of his fellow officers as aggressive, quick to escalate, the kind of cop who treated every stop like it might be the one that mattered. That night, he was parked in a gas station lot watching traffic when a black sedan blew through the intersection at what his radar clocked as 53 in a 35. He pulled out behind it. Lights on, no siren yet, standard procedure, giving the driver a chance to notice and comply. Marcus saw the lights in his mirror and felt something close to panic, the specific panic of a man who has spent his whole career learning to control his emotions in operating rooms, now discovering that a traffic stop could unravel him faster than any surgery ever had. He knew the rules. Every black man in America who drives learns the rules early, whether anyone teaches them formally or not. Pull over immediately. Hands visible. No sudden movements. Comply first, explain second. He signaled, slowed, and pulled to the shoulder. He put the car in park. He turned on the interior dome light so the officer could see inside clearly. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, spread his fingers, and waited. What he could not do was wait quietly. Somewhere across the city, a 12-year-old girl named Sofia Alvarez was being kept alive by a resident whose hands were shaking, packing her abdomen to slow bleeding. He didn't have the experience to definitively stop. Every minute Marcus sat on this shoulder was a minute closer to a phone call no parent should ever receive. Officer Bratton approached from the rear, per protocol, flashlight sweeping the interior before he reached the window. He saw a man in what looked like medical scrubs, hands on the wheel, engine running, dome light on. None of that registered the way it should have. What registered was a driver who had been speeding recklessly through a residential area at close to midnight, and a driver whose posture, to Bratton's eye, read as tense in a way he associated with people who had something to hide. Marcus rolled the window down before Bratton reached it. "License and registration," Bratton said, flashlight aimed directly into Marcus's eyes. "Officer, I'm a surgeon at St. Vincent Memorial. I'm being called in for an emergency pediatric trauma case. I have a badge in my bag on the passenger seat. I need to get there. Please, can we do this quickly?" Bratton didn't move his flashlight. "Everybody's got somewhere to be. License and registration. Now." Marcus reached slowly toward the glove compartment, narrating every motion the way he'd been taught his entire adult life. "I'm reaching for my registration. It's in the glove box. I'm moving slowly." Bratton's hand drifted to his belt, resting near his weapon, watching the movement with an intensity that had nothing to do with routine and everything to do with instinct trained on the wrong assumptions. Marcus handed over his license and registration. Both came back clean immediately. No warrants, no violations beyond the speed. A completely unremarkable record belonging to a man who had spent his entire adult life being careful, being exceptional, being twice as good to be considered half as suspicious. None of it mattered in that moment, because Bratton had already decided what kind of stop this was going to be. "I clocked you at 53 in a 35, Bratton said. "That's reckless driving. Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, please, I don't have time for this. There's a child in surgery right now who needs me. I can show you my hospital badge. I can call the OR, and you can speak to the charge nurse directly. Anything, but I need to go. Step out of the vehicle." That wasn't a request. This is the moment that would define everything that came after. Marcus had 2 options, and he knew both of them by heart, because he had spent 31 years as a black man in America, absorbing the calculus of police encounters the way other people absorb multiplication tables. Comply, and lose minutes that might cost Sofia Alvarez her life. Refuse and risk an escalation whose ending nobody could predict. He stepped out of the car. "Turn around, hands behind your back. Officer, I have not committed a crime beyond a traffic violation. I am a licensed physician on my way to save a child's life. I am asking you, please, let me show you my identification. Let me make one phone call." Bratton's hand left his belt and moved to his weapon. "Don't argue with me. Turn around." What happened in the next 90 seconds would later be reconstructed, frame by attorneys, expert witnesses, and eventually a federal jury, because Bratton's body camera captured every second of it in crisp, unforgiving detail. Marcus, frustrated, exhausted, and terrified for a child he had never met, made a decision that would nearly cost him his freedom and almost certainly cost Sofia her life. He turned back toward his car, not away from Bratton, but toward the passenger seat, reaching for the bag that held his hospital badge, the only piece of proof that might end this in seconds instead of minutes. Bratton saw a man he had already ordered to turn around instead, lunging back toward the vehicle. Every instinct his training had built, some of it sound, much of it warped by years of unconscious bias, reinforced rather than corrected, screamed one word: weapon. "Get away from the car! Get away from the car now!" Marcus didn't hear him, not really, not in a way that registered as anything other than noise, layered over the sound of his own racing heartbeat and Sofia Alvarez's blood pressure numbers looping through his mind. He grabbed the strap of his bag. Bratton drew his service weapon and leveled it at Marcus's chest from 8 feet away. "Get on the ground! Get on the ground now, or I will shoot." Marcus froze, both hands rising instinctively, the bag falling from his fingers back onto the seat. Every trauma surgery he had ever performed, every gunshot wound he had ever repaired, every young man he had ever tried to save from exactly this kind of ending, collapsed into a single suspended second where he understood, with total clarity, that his life was balanced on the trigger discipline of a stranger who had already decided who he was. "I am not reaching for a weapon," Marcus said, his voice breaking for the first time. "I am a doctor. I am trying to show you my badge. There is a 12-year-old girl in an operating room right now who will die if I don't get there. Please, please just let me show you. Get on the ground. This is your last warning." Marcus got on the ground. The asphalt was cold against his palms, cold against his cheek when Bratton ordered him fully prone, cold in a way that felt like it belonged to a different version of his life than the one he'd been living 40 minutes earlier, when his biggest concern was whether he'd get more than 3 hours of sleep before his next shift. Bratton holstered his weapon only after Marcus was face down, hands behind his back, cuffs closing around wrists that 6 hours later would be inside a 12-year-old's abdomen, steady as ever, doing the work no one else in that hospital could do. Except that wasn't what happened next. Not yet. Because Bratton wasn't finished, and the story of what happened in the back of that patrol car, and what happened 3 hours later at St. Vincent Memorial, and what a jury would eventually decide this entire encounter was worth in dollars and reputations, was still unfolding. Bratton called for backup before he'd even run Marcus's name through his radio a second time. Standard procedure, he would claim later. A second patrol car arrived within 4 minutes, Officer Rene Castillo behind the wheel, 7 years on the force, a reputation for being methodical rather than reactive. Castillo took one look at the scene, a handcuffed man face down on the pavement, an idling black Lexus with the dome light still on, a bag visible on the passenger seat with what looked unmistakably like a hospital ID badge clipped to the strap, and felt something tighten in her stomach. "What's the charge?" she asked Bratton, reckless driving, resisting, attempting to flee back toward the vehicle. I believe he may have been reaching for a weapon. Castillo walked closer, crouched down near Marcus, who was still on the ground, cheek pressed to asphalt, breathing hard. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" "I'm a surgeon," Marcus said, his voice hoarse now. "St. Vincent Memorial, room 412. There is a 12-year-old patient in emergency surgery right now, and I am the vascular specialist on call. My badge is in the bag on my passenger seat. Please, someone, call the hospital. Ask for the charge nurse in the OR. Her name is Patricia Nkemdirim. She'll confirm everything." Castillo looked at Bratton. "Did you check the bag?" "No," Bratton said. He reached for it. "I gave a lawful order to stay away from the vehicle." Castillo stood, walked to the open passenger door, and looked inside without touching anything, the way her training had taught her to preserve whatever this scene might become. She saw scrubs balled up next to the bag. She saw a laminated hospital badge with a photograph that matched the man handcuffed on the ground, the name Dr. Marcus Webb printed beneath it, the words trauma and vascular surgery beneath that. "Bratton," she said quietly, "I think you need to call this in." "He's resisting arrest," Bratton said again, as though repeating it enough times might make it more true than what was sitting in plain view 18 inches from his own eyes. Castillo didn't argue further. She radioed dispatch directly, requesting verification. Possible medical emergency involving detained subject claiming to be an on-call physician at St. Vincent Memorial. Need confirmation on a Dr. Marcus Webb, trauma surgery, and need it fast. The answer came back in under 90 seconds, because St. Vincent Memorial's night administrator had, in fact, already begun making frantic calls of her own. Marcus's phone, still in the car, had been ringing continuously for the last 6 minutes, missed calls stacking up from the hospital operator, from the charge nurse, from the chief of surgery himself, all of them trying to reach a man who was supposed to have arrived 11 minutes ago and instead was lying handcuffed on the shoulder of Ashland Avenue. "Confirmed," dispatch said. Dr. Marcus Webb, credentialed physician, currently listed as required for an active surgical case. Hospital is requesting immediate release and transport. "Get him up," Castillo said. Bratton hesitated, the muscles in his jaw working, some part of him still refusing to fully process what had just happened. He pulled Marcus upright and removed the cuffs, the metal leaving red imprints on wrists that had spent 13 years learning to be perfectly steady under pressure. "I'm sorry," Bratton said, the words coming out flat, procedural, nothing like an apology should sound. Marcus didn't answer him. He grabbed his bag, checked his badge was still clipped inside, and looked at Castillo instead. "Can someone get me there? Now, please." Castillo made the decision in less time than it takes to say it. She would drive Marcus to St. Vincent Memorial herself, lights on, the 4 remaining minutes of driving compressed into just over 90 seconds of controlled, deliberate urgency, while Bratton stood on the shoulder of Ashland Avenue, watching his career quietly begin to end without yet understanding it. Marcus walked into St. Vincent Memorial at 12:19 a.m., 32 minutes after he'd first gotten the call, still in his street clothes, hands shaking from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. He scrubbed in without a word to anyone about what had just happened to him, because Sofia Alvarez's blood pressure was still dropping, and there wasn't time for anything except the work. The surgery took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Marcus found the injury the resident hadn't been able to control, a small tear in a mesenteric vessel hiding beneath layers of clotted blood, and he closed it with the same steady hands that, 90 minutes earlier, had been cuffed behind his back on a public road. Sofia Alvarez survived the night. She would go home to her parents 11 days later, walking on her own, carrying a scar and, though she wouldn't learn the full story for months, a debt to a man who had been handcuffed on his way to save her. Marcus didn't tell anyone at the hospital what had happened that night, not immediately. He went home at 4 a.m., sat on the edge of his bed, and told Danielle everything in a voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear it. She was the one who insisted, the very next morning, that they call a lawyer. They found attorney Rachel Kim, a civil rights litigator with a track record of taking on police departments and winning not through emotional appeals, but through relentless documentation. Rachel listened to Marcus's account, then asked the question that would define the entire case. Was there body camera footage? Yeah, there was, and it would take 3 weeks, 2 formal requests, and 1 threat of subpoena before the department released it. When Rachel finally watched it, she watched it 4 times in a row, taking notes each time, building a timeline down to the second. The footage showed everything Marcus had described, and it showed something else too, something that would matter enormously later. It showed Bratton's own dashboard microphone catching a conversation with Castillo, off camera but not off audio, in which Bratton could be heard saying, almost dismissively, "These guys always got a story about being somebody important." That sentence would become Exhibit 14. Rachel's investigation didn't stop with the footage from that night. She requested Bratton's full personnel file through Discovery, and what she found was a pattern the department had spent years quietly managing rather than correcting. 3 prior citizen complaints, all involving black male drivers, all alleging excessive escalation during routine stops, 2 dismissed after internal review that consisted of little more than Bratton's own written statement, 1 resulting in a single afternoon of retraining that had clearly done nothing to change his instincts under pressure. She also requested the department's use of force statistics for Bratton's patrol zone over the previous 4 years. The numbers were stark. Black drivers in his sector were stopped at nearly 3 times the rate of white drivers in the same area, despite comparable population demographics. Force was used, everything from drawn weapons to physical restraint, in a disproportionate share of those stops. The department's early intervention system, the internal mechanism specifically designed to flag officers showing patterns of escalation, had never triggered a review of Bratton's record, despite data that in hindsight painted an unmistakable picture. The lawsuit Rachel filed on Marcus's behalf named the city, the police department, and Officer Kyle Bratton individually. The claims were comprehensive and precise. Unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion once identification and context were provided. Excessive force through the drawing of a firearm against an unarmed, compliant individual. Violation of civil rights under color of law. Negligent supervision and training, given the department's documented history with this specific officer. And a claim that would prove unusually powerful in front of a jury. Tortious interference with the performance of a licensed medical professional's duties during an active life-threatening emergency, given that the delay Bratton caused very nearly cost a 12-year-old patient her life. That last claim required expert testimony, and Rachel found it in Dr. Anita Reyes, a hospital administrator and former trauma surgeon herself, who reviewed Sofia Alvarez's medical timeline and concluded, in a report that would later be read aloud in open court, that a delay of even 10 additional minutes in Dr. Webb's arrival carried a meaningfully elevated risk of the patient's death on the table. The 32 minutes lost to the traffic stop had not been 32 minutes of inconvenience. They had been 32 minutes stolen from the narrow window between a child living and a child not living, minutes that were only recovered because Officer Castillo made a decision her partner had refused to make. The city's attorneys, reviewing the body camera footage, the personnel file, the use of force statistics, and Dr. Reyes's report, understood almost immediately how this would look in front of a jury in a courtroom with cameras present. They pushed for early settlement talks. Rachel refused the first offer outright, $400,000, calling it an insult dressed up as a resolution. The case proceeded toward trial for 14 months, through depositions that grew increasingly uncomfortable for the department. Bratton, under oath, was asked directly why he hadn't checked the passenger seat before assuming Marcus was reaching for a weapon. His answer, "I didn't have time to consider every possibility," was read back to him alongside body camera timestamps, showing he had, in fact, stood within arm's reach of that bag for over 2 full minutes before drawing his weapon. He was asked why he told Officer Castillo that people like Marcus always got a story. He claimed he meant it generally, not specifically about race. The prosecution's expert on implicit bias in policing, Dr. Samuel Ortiz, testified that the pattern in Bratton's stop, data, disproportionate escalation specifically against black male drivers, made that explanation difficult to sustain as a matter of statistical fact rather than personal intention. Dr. Ortiz walked the jury through 4 years of dashboard and body camera footage from stops across Bratton's patrol zone, comparing outcomes side by side. White drivers stopped for comparable or greater speed. Violations were, in the recorded sample, asked to step out of their vehicles in a small fraction of cases. Black drivers stopped for similar violations were asked to step out and had weapons drawn against them, at a rate Ortiz described as statistically almost impossible to explain through chance alone. He was careful, under cross-examination, not to characterize Bratton as uniquely malicious. His testimony instead focused on something the jury seemed to find more unsettling than outright animus: the idea that an officer could sincerely believe he was being neutral, while his body, trained by years of reinforced assumption, reacted to the same behavior differently depending on who was performing it. It wasn't a story about one bad man, Ortiz told the jury. It was a story about a system that had never forced him to notice the pattern, let alone correct it. Marcus testified on the 3rd day of trial. He described, in the same measured clinical voice he might use to explain a surgical procedure, exactly what it felt like to lie on cold asphalt with a gun pointed at him while a child's life hung in the balance 2 miles away. He described the specific moment he understood that reaching for his own identification, the one thing that could end the encounter immediately, was the single most dangerous thing he could do. He described what it felt like to scrub into surgery 90 minutes later with his wrists still bearing the marks of handcuffs, and to say nothing to his surgical team because there simply wasn't time to process what had happened to him as a man before he needed to function as a doctor. Several jurors, according to court observers, were visibly moved. One later told a reporter outside the courthouse that what stayed with her wasn't the drawn weapon, it was learning that a 12-year-old girl's survival had come down, in part, to whether a police officer would look inside a bag sitting 18 inches from his own eyes. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. They returned a verdict, finding the city and Officer Bratton liable on every count. The damages awarded totaled $3.4 million, covering the violation of Marcus's civil rights, the physical and psychological harm of the detention itself, and a specific punitive component tied directly to the danger the delay had posed to a patient whose life was not Marcus's own, but whose survival had depended entirely on him. Officer Kyle Bratton was terminated from the department 11 days after the verdict. His name was submitted to the state's decertification registry, permanently barring him from law enforcement work anywhere within its borders. The 3 prior complaints against him, previously dismissed with minimal review, were formally reopened as part of a broader Department of Justice inquiry into the department's pattern of escalation in traffic stops involving black drivers, an inquiry that would eventually result in a consent decree mandating retrained use of force protocols, revised de-escalation certification for all officers, and a new department-wide policy explicitly requiring officers to verify claimed professional credentials, medical, legal, or otherwise, before escalating a stop to physical restraint whenever those credentials could be reasonably checked without unnecessary delay. Officer René Castillo, whose decision to independently verify Marcus's story and personally drive him to the hospital that night likely prevented both a wrongful death and a far graver legal outcome, was commended publicly by the department, one of the only positive notes in an otherwise damning institutional record. She was later promoted and now leads a training module for incoming officers, built directly around the details of that night, using the actual body camera footage, redacted as a teaching tool for what verification under pressure is supposed to look like. Marcus Webb still practices at St. Vincent Memorial. He still takes overnight calls. He still drives the same stretch of Ashland Avenue more often than he would like, and by his own account, still feels his pulse climb every time he sees flashing lights in his rearview mirror. An involuntary response his own medical training has a clinical name for, but that no amount of clinical language makes any easier to carry. He used a portion of the settlement to establish a fund at St. Vincent Memorial, specifically supporting legal advocacy for hospital staff who experience discriminatory encounters with law enforcement while responding to emergency calls, a problem, it turned out once the story became public, that was far more common among on-call medical staff of color than most hospital administrators had ever tracked or acknowledged. Sofia Alvarez's family, once they learned the full story months after her recovery, asked to meet Marcus in person. Her mother, according to those present, held his hands for a long moment and simply said, "Thank you," though everyone in the room understood there was very little language adequate to the size of what had actually happened that night. Marcus has said, in the handful of interviews he eventually agreed to give, that the hardest part was never the gun, and never the handcuffs, and never even the fear. The hardest part was the 90 minutes afterward, standing over an open incision, hands perfectly steady, doing the most important work of his career while carrying, silently, the knowledge of exactly how close that work had come to never happening at all. He says he doesn't want sympathy for what happened to him. He wants departments to understand that the 4 minutes it takes to verify a badge will always cost less than the price of being wrong, whether that price is measured in a settlement check or in a child who does not make it home. That is the question this case leaves behind, one that outlasted the verdict and the termination and the eventual consent decree. What is the actual cost of assuming the worst about someone before you have taken the 4 minutes required to find out the truth? For Officer Bratton, it was a career. For the city, it was $3.4 million. For a 12-year-old girl named Sofia Alvarez, it was almost everything. And for Dr. Marcus Webb, it was 32 minutes he will never get back, and a memory of cold asphalt that no operating room, however many lives he saves inside it, has ever fully erased.